Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started while people are still coming in. We don't want to hold you past your lunchtime. Thank you for coming. My name is Sonia Pruitt. I'm a professor here at Montgomery College. This webinar is a sort of like a collaboration between Nkechi and I. We were having a conversation about unintended consequences of policy and law in this country. And what we mean by unintended consequences is perhaps the policy was developed for a particular reason, and then it turned out that there was some disparate impact on vulnerable communities. Or it could mean perhaps that it was intentional that this policy or law came about, but the actual impact of that policy and law are much greater than we could have imagined. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And as it pertains to what we call the criminal legal system, because we are still searching for justice, right? So I am thrilled to have this panel. You see, I'm smiling from ear to ear because everyone on this panel is someone that I admire, that has mentored me somehow, and who is a good friend to me. So I'm excited to introduce them to you. And one thing that I would love to go over with the audience is feel free to express yourself. If you have a question, I ask that you put it in the Q&A. I'm going to introduce you to Shawn Kennedy shortly because he's going to be monitoring the Q&A for questions. And also feel free to talk to one another in the chat. We want you to be engaged, okay? If you see something that you don't agree with, or you hear something you don't agree with, it's okay. Everyone has an entitlement to their own opinion, right? So we're here to learn. We're here to educate you. We're here for you to learn. I'm here to learn as well. So let's look at it from that vantage point, all right? Again, this is being recorded. If you are concerned about that, somehow know that you can, if you want to leave, we can always make sure that you get a copy of the recording. You're not going to be on camera, but even if you don't want your name to show up, we're going to record this and you can watch it later. Let your friends know they can also watch it later. So first thing I'm going to do is introduce you to the person who's going to be behind the scenes helping us with the Q&A, and that's Shawn Kennedy. This is my friend and colleague, kind of like my partner in crime a little bit, because whenever I need to talk to somebody, I call him and you know, vent. Shawn is a retired sergeant and 29-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department, where he worked in the patrol division as a detective in the domestic violence program and in the internal affairs section, in the management and labor affairs, and in the office of the superintendent in the Bureau of Organizational Development, which is a professional counseling division. Shawn's focus, and he never stops talking about this, is officer wellness, reduction of police suicides, and removing the stigma associated with mental illness. Last but not least, Shawn is the chairman of the National Association of Black Law Enforcement Officers. So Shawn, thank you for assisting us today.
Thank you for asking. I appreciate it. You're making me blush. This
I got love for program.
You. Thank you.
So now let me introduce our outstanding panelists for today's event. And just so you know, the run of show is going to be that I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to ask them a couple of questions to get the conversation started. So you can begin putting your questions in the Q&A, because after all of them get to speak on their particular area of expertise, then we will start going through some of the questions that you might have. Okay, first is Nkechi Taifa. I'm sorry. This is the beautiful woman in red today. She is a civil and human rights attorney, scholar, activist, and an author. She's president of the Taifa Group, director of the Reparation Education Project, and serves as senior fellow for the Center of Justice at Columbia University. She also served as commissioner and chair of the DC Commission on Human Rights. And Nkechi's credentials are really, really long, having worked with Open Society Foundations, Howard University School of Law, the ACLU, Women's Legal Defense Fund, the National Prison Project, and as an attorney in private practice. She was in the leadership of the Justice Roundtable Coalition, which successfully mobilized the passage of both the Second Chance Act, that was in 2008, and the Fair Sentencing Act, crack disparity legislation, which was in 2010, which gained inclusion of strong sentencing provisions in the First Step Act of 2018. She helped fuel mobilization of the Obama administration's clemency initiative, which resulted in the early release from unjust imprisonment of over 1,700 people. Finally, Nkechi has authored scores of scholarly works and received numerous honors and awards. Nkechi is one of my partners in crime also when it comes to social advocacy. So welcome to our dynamic soul sister, Nkechi. Diane Goldstein. Diane is a 21-year veteran of law enforcement who served as the first female lieutenant for the Redondo Beach, California Police Department. She is currently the executive director of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, better known as LEAP, which is a group of criminal justice professionals that work to advance justice and public safety solutions. Diane is also a guest columnist for many media organizations and is recognized as a subject matter expert on criminal justice and drug policy. Diane is also incredibly humble. She is smart, she is hardworking, she is committed, and she sets a great example for women in law enforcement, as she has for me. And I am proud to work closely with her on the board of directors of LEAP. So welcome, Diane.
So like Shawn said, is like I'm blushing, and I so appreciate the support and the women's solidarity. So
absolutely.
Thanks, Sonia.
You're welcome.
Not that I don't appreciate you men, I do.
They're okay. Today, they're okay. So then let's talk about the men. Neill. Major Neill Franklin, a 34-year law enforcement veteran, retired from the Maryland State Police in 1999 after rising through the ranks from undercover narcotics agent to a commander within the Bureau of Drug and Criminal Enforcement. Post-retirement, Major Franklin, or Neill as we call him, worked an additional 10 years with the Baltimore Police Department and the Maryland Transit Police Force before assuming the Law Enforcement Action Partnership's executive director position in 2010, which he held until 2020. In addition to being accepted in Maryland circuit and federal courts as a law enforcement expert witness, he is a regular guest commentator on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News networks. What Neill's bio does not say is that he is a humble servant and a credible messenger on matters of the criminal legal system. And I am glad to be able to call him my friend and my mentor. Thanks for joining us, Neill.
My pleasure. Thank you, Sonia. I'm blushing too, if you look me up.
Yes. Finally, but not least, Dr. Khalfani Toure is a 5-year veteran of policing out of Georgia. He's no longer a police officer, everyone. He is a doctor of anthropology and a professor in the Department of Sociology, Criminal Justice, and Human Services at Mount St. Mary's University. He is also a senior fellow in the Urban Ethnography Project at Yale University and has emerged as one of the nation's leading experts on policing and gentrification. His educational career actually includes teaching here at our own Montgomery College. Ture has provided expertise and insight to national media outlets such as the New York Times, USA Today, Atlanta Constitutional Journal, and the Associated Press. And he has appeared live on MSNBC, NPR, Fox News, and CNN. He is a frequent guest lecturer at Rutgers, Yale, and our own Morgan State University here in Maryland. His activism around police reform is featured in a soon-to-be released film on police and racialized violence. Currently, he is researching and writing 2 significant book manuscripts that cover gentrification and policing, respectively. Dr. Ture and I share in common a deep love of house music. If you don't know what house music is, just contact me after the webinar and I'll hook you up, okay? So finally, I'm your host and your moderator. Many of you know me from the college community, of course, but for those who don't, I'm a professor of criminal justice here at Montgomery College. Prior to becoming an educator, I spent 28 years in the Montgomery County Police Department, where I retired as the Director of Community Engagement and the first Black woman to attain the rank of captain. Also post-retirement, I created the Black Police Experience, which promotes education and history of the intersection of law enforcement and the Black community. Some of my other endeavors is as a board member of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, past chairperson of the National Black Police Association, and of particular note, and some of my colleagues from this organization or this group are here on this webinar, is a venture called the National Strategy for Blacks in Policing, which was founded by one of our attendees, Tracy Kesey. The programming is designed to create courageous and ethical law enforcement leadership and to support Black police officers in their quest for equity inside police departments through legal representation and mental health support. It is my pleasure to moderate today's educational session, so let's get started. Don't forget to put your questions in the chat, okay? I'm sorry, in the Q&A, not the chat, but the Q&A, and talk to one another in the chat. So, to start us off on this conversation, Nkechi, the first question comes to you. Can you give us a history of how and why you think there is a disparity between sentencing relative to crack cocaine and sentencing relative to powdered cocaine?
Yes, Sonia, thank you so much. And I want to tie this all into the whole theme dealing with unintended consequences. And I want to thank you, Sonia, for pulling us together. I want to thank my illustrious fellow panelists. And I want to thank Montgomery College for hosting this. So I have a whole lot to say about unintended consequences and the crack powder disparity. And in the past, I often spoke in my presentations on criminal legal system reform about a not so fictitious woman named Miss Pearl, who lived on the corner and was scared to venture off her front porch because of the drugs in her community. And she was the excuse that the police would use, who were disproportionately deployed to her community, frequently engaged in stop and frisk, jacking youth up against cars, arresting them, throwing in jails. And they would say that they came to her communities in militarized force because she would call them, and that is what she expected. And they would say that she told them to get them off the corner and out of community. And so, Sonia, I began to ponder, why would Miss Pearl do that? And I would say, is it because the correct message had not reached her? Is it because she had been inundated and captivated with erroneous media depictions? And because the media did not focus on it, she did not know that there were viable alternatives to a criminal punishment approach to drugs in her community. She didn't understand the consequences of drug sentencing, that it didn't matter if college student Kimber Smith got caught up with the wrong guy, that he beat her and threatened her and her family so bad that she was scared to come forward about his drug dealing. It didn't matter that she's pregnant when thrown in prison. It didn't matter that she never used or handled any drugs. The drug law said that she had to serve time, 24 and a half years of it, and that there were no mitigating or extenuating circumstances when it came to these sentences. She didn't understand, Sonia, about the infamous 100-to-1 ratio between crack and powder cocaine, that the Black boys in the hood who were convicted of selling 5 grams of crack, the weight of about a couple of packs of sugar, worth perhaps only $125, received a mandatory prison term of 5 years, whereas it took 500 grams of powder cocaine, the drug choice of whites, worth nearly $50,000 to receive that same 5-year sentence. She was unaware of the gross sentencing disparity between this seemingly race-neutral law, and she was unaware that there was really no pharmacological distinction between crack and powder cocaine, and as such, there should not have been a difference in punishment. She didn't know that 1/3 of all federal cocaine cases involved just the average weight of 52 grams, the weight of an ordinary candy bar. And she did not know that young Tyrone standing out there on the corner was not a major drug kingpin, was not a super predator, and that the federal government really had no business in his prosecution. And she didn't know that the building of prison base was predicated upon the test scores of Black boys in the 3rd grade. She didn't know about any of these really consequences of convictions. She was clueless, and many of us were clueless during those early years about the unintended consequences of laws that were passed, about the racial disparities and consequences on very real people. And she never thought to think about the impact on political empowerment in the Black community as a result of 250,000 Black men being disenfranchised as a result of the felony convictions that ensued from these laws, and that every single social issue was exacerbated or magnified once one is released from prison. So the reason why I bring all this up, I've been in the criminal legal system dealing with reform and transformation for decades. And it's been really over 36 years since that crack powder cocaine law was passed. And despite the 2010 passage of the Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced that 101 disparity between crack and powder cocaine, there is still a disparity. We are still fighting after now over 35 years to rectify it. So it's why I'm so very vigilant today, as everyone should be, when I see handwriting on the wall, where it appears as if policymakers are contemplating laws that can once again fall down that slippery slope of unintended consequences, that we nip them in the bud and we look at other ways of dealing with very real social problems as opposed to just always looking at the punitive approach. So I always harken back to my crack powder. I mean, I never used drugs. I don't believe in crack and all like that, but I am very much zealous about laws that should be fair and laws that don't have a disproportionate impact on Black and other people of color communities.
Okay, so you just got, that was powerful, Nkechi, and you started us off just like I knew that you would. And as a matter of fact, I had a follow-up question for you, which you actually answered, which was, what's the unintended consequence for affected communities? So, you know, that was a beautiful answer. And thank you. It was really educational too, I'm sure, for a lot of people, including me, because there's a couple of things I wrote down and I'm going to come back to that I had questions about. Okay, next up, Diane. Diane, here is your question. Cannabis is being decriminalized and legalized all over the country. What is your opinion on that? And why is the conversation surrounding decriminalization and legalization so important?
So there's, boy, this coming in after Nkechi, I also want to tie in the issues relative to moral scares. And it's not just about cannabis. You know, as important as cannabis has been, legalization in particular, for us as a wedge to blow the entire drug war up, I don't want your students or others who are attending here to think that our work stops just because we're going to win the war on cannabis. That's coming. But it's really critically important because Nkechi said something about the powder and crack disparities. We're seeing the same thing right now with fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. And at the federal level, it's people of color who are winding up in federal prison, in bureau prison, with disparities in sentencing, and they're not kingpins. So let's, you know, cannabis is important, but this unintended consequences is really reflective of the whole entire drug war. So I think that folks hopefully know the history of drug control and social control that targeted minorities in particular, dating back to 1914 with the Harrison Tax Act and then the Marijuana Tax Act. And then this evolved into the modern day drug war based on Richard Nixon. I think in 1968, a few years ago, John Ehrlichman came out and made a statement that Nixon proposed the drug war simply as a way to attack the hippies and the Blacks back then. So it was going to be a wedge enforcement issues. And to Eric's point, you know, There were, in fact, people who I think had this good intention that drugs are bad, there's moral issues, and so we should save people from themselves. I think that's always been the intent of our drug policies. And the modern day version, unfortunately, moved from people understanding that it was targeted at immigrants or people that were different from them into a supposed, issue of there's no intention on our drug laws to target minorities. And that's just not accurate. Historically, contextually, that's not accurate. And so what we know is, because I policed in Los Angeles County, a beach community that would never allow the drug war tactics that I participated in when I was working and managing a gang unit and a surveillance unit, when we were doing multi-agency jurisdictional work, and we'd roll into South Central Los Angeles. There are communities that would not put up with that, but for whatever reason, it was thought that these tactics were going to be beneficial and we're going to eradicate crime in the drug war. So for me, our drug laws are very intentional. And maybe for some people, they're unintentional. So cannabis, I want to point out that 50 years ago, we had the Schaefer Commission that came out that basically noted this in particular about cannabis, that the potential harm of the use of cannabis is not great enough to justify intrusion by the criminal justice system into private behavior. We need to be very clear that we've always known that with cannabis in particular, yes, there's harms, but there were never going to be the harms maybe from some other drugs that are in fact more dangerous. And there was a deliberate intent by our government to use it as a wedge issue in order to socially control certain communities. And so the importance of both decriminalization and legalization. So right now we're working on some projects with Marijuana Policy Project to highlight the importance of decriminalization as an incremental step to make people's lives better. But until we sensibly regulate cannabis and all drugs in a variety of different ways, we're going to continue this failed war on drugs. And so we need to be very mindful that just because we legalize in a state, yes, it reduces harms. It reduces harms both in communities of color and in white communities, and it lessens the impact of the criminal justice system. But even in places where we have sensibly regulated or legalized, there are still racial disparities. And so we have to continue to fight to remove the tool for law enforcement to target people of color, period, simple, end of story. And so I'm with Nkechi. It's, this is a two-pronged thing. All our drug laws are based on moral scares. All our drug laws have both intentional and unintentional consequences. But the unintentional consequences of even maybe like, today's soccer mom who wants to protect her kid from, the harms of starting to smoke tobacco or do drugs or alcohol needs to be solved, not through a criminal justice lens, but from public health interventions and evidence-based outcomes.
Once again, I'm sitting over here. I think I'm probably going to need to get a new pad because of all the notes that I have taken. You too answered your second question, Diane, about the unintended consequence of cannabis laws on our most vulnerable communities, especially the Black community. So thank you. That was a very thorough answer, and I can't wait to circle back around and have some more questions for you. Neill, you're up next. So Neill, your question is several, and audience, I'm not sure how much you've heard about this topic, but you are probably in for an educational treat on this. So Neill, several localities and states are introducing legislation to ban flavored tobacco products and menthol cigarettes. Can you tell our audience more about this developing trend and your perception on how this will affect our vulnerable communities?
Sure. So this trend began probably a little over a decade ago. It was a group of people who, very intelligent people, a number of them professors and some physicians, who are looking at the use of tobacco within the Black community. And yes, it's been a big problem over the years. They've also been looking at how, as they would say, big tobacco has targeted Black communities over, past few decades, which used to be a problem, which now no longer is. As you know, ads have been taken out of off of TV. They've been taken off of out of our communities, away from our children. And there's been a lot of change. There's been a lot of money put into smoking cessation programs. As Diane said, there's been a dramatic decrease through education and health related initiatives to reduce the use of tobacco within all of our communities, and the numbers continue to go down. However, this group of folks decided that years ago, they approached the FDA in an attempt to ban, again, beginning with flavored cigarettes and menthol cigarettes. But they failed. And so they regrouped and they figured, well, let's start with local communities. It might be a lot easier, which it is, to go to a smaller community. So that's what they did. So beginning in the western part of the United States in Oregon, Portland, Oregon, again, passing local ordinances for this, banning the sale of menthol and flavored tobacco products. It then goes down into the California, San Francisco area, Oakland, then LA area. It then moves across to the Chicago area. It's now in the Northeast part of the country. State of Massachusetts actually passed legislation, I think it was in 2020, again, restricting the sale of these flavored tobacco products and menthol products as well. And I mean, if you like, I can go into what we're beginning to see and what some of the results are and how it's becoming a problem. And right now there's another effort in DC, again, with the FDA, again, to try to get a nationwide ban on not just the sale, but also the manufacturing of menthol cigarettes here in the United States. So let me just say what we're beginning to see and what, from my experience in law enforcement, especially working within criminal and narcotics investigation over the past few decades, what no doubt will happen. Let me just comment quickly on Massachusetts, what we're beginning to see. Number one, they've created a task force in Massachusetts, and this is one of the things that we fear. They've created a multi-agency task force to deal with the smuggling of now illegal cigarettes coming into the state of Massachusetts. New Hampshire, we're getting a lot of cigarettes coming from New Hampshire, which is right above Massachusetts, and they're even seeing them coming into the state from as far away as Virginia and North Carolina. So what does that tell us? So being, a police officer for the many years that I've had, from a public safety perspective, what we're beginning to do is open a door extremely wide for robust smuggling and distribution networks. The things that, Diane was talking about, some of our drug laws of the past, and, things that are common among such illicit networks. Well, here's some of them. What we've learned through history is that violence follows illicit networks for popular commodities, whether we're talking about alcohol from the 1920s we thought we learned a lesson from back then, or whether we're talking about the current war on drugs. Violence will follow that illicit market, and it's only a matter of time before that happens. And so the violence follows the smuggling routes. It also follows the street distribution, the neighborhoods. I'm from Baltimore, very familiar with, problems among our street corners and with feuding gangs and cartels, and also just neighborhood crews. Criminals hire children, hold, run, sell their goods, run their street level markets. The competition creates the violence. And then when you have that, who's brought in? The police are brought in. And police are put under pressure to find out who's smuggling these goods, to find out, where the violence is coming from, to deal with the street corner operations, and on and on and on. The proceeds from such illicit markets also help to prop up other criminal efforts such as human trafficking. We know that, it's documented, it's history. We're not learning from history, apparently. So when the police come in, here are some of the other problems that occur. Some of the things that we're trying to change today. Most of the interactions gone wrong with policing are from very, very minor interactions with the police. And don't be fooled by the rhetoric that we're not going to make it illegal for someone to possess or smoke tobacco. But here's what we, the police, do. The quickest way to finding a smuggler, the quickest way to finding the person who's selling in the neighborhood is to go after the people who are using. So we can't go after you for using the cigarette. You just jaywalked across the street. I'll hem you up for that. Minor traffic violations, loitering, trespassing, loud music, whatever we can come up with. And there you have the interaction, because we're going to pressure you for information on who's selling and who's smuggling the cigarettes. Or that's one of the reasons we're changing our policies with marijuana today, right? Because we've seen the problems with that. And then the distrust comes in. And I'll wrap this up here. This is extremely important, distrust. Because when we start with the drag nets, when we start hemming people up for these minor violations to get information on who's smuggling, the distrust comes in because how we're treating community members. And when we have distrust, we cannot get information on violent crime. And there's no way that we, the police, can solve violent crime within our communities unless we have the cooperation of our citizens, the people who live in those communities. And when they don't trust you, they're not going to give you the information that you need. Violent crime continues to go up. We can't find the people who are committing these crimes, and it just continues to soar. So those are just some of the problems that we foresee down the road. History tells us this, and hopefully we won't get too far down the road before we start rolling back some of these local policies that have already taken effect. But the one thing we cannot do is allow a national ban, prohibition on the selling of tobacco. Let's stay where we belong in health and education.
Thank you, Neill. I have a question. So for the audience, if the ban is only on flavored tobacco, or in particular menthol cigarettes, so what we're saying is then that people who tend to smoke menthol cigarettes will have a greater possibility of interaction with the police than people who do not smoke menthol cigarettes. Yet the people who don't smoke menthol will not be afoul of the law at all. And the people who smoke menthol cigarettes the most are people of color, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You're right. 85% of the smokers within the Black community, the Latino communities, 85% of those smokers use, and I'm talking about adults, I'm not talking about kids here, I'm talking about grown folks, use menthol cigarettes. And I don't know if you've had conversations with these folks, but I have. They're not giving them up as long as they can get them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, Neill. Appreciate it. So Khalfani Toure, ready for your question. You and I have had several conversations about how laws and police policy, though often created by potentially well-meaning legislatures and police executives tend to lead to disparate police encounters with the community. So can you give us some examples of what some of those laws or policies are and how they have unintended negative consequences, particularly for Black and Brown people?
Absolutely. And I hope your audience can hear me clearly. First, let me say thank you so much for having me. My teaching career, actually, when I left policing, was at Montgomery College. And so it feels good to be back home. And also thank you for coupling me with such dynamic and esteemed scholars and practitioners on this panel. I'm going to draw from Nkechi and Diane's comments around drugs and also Neill's comments around history. And I apologize in advance, but one of the occupational hazards that I have is trying to sort of be more dialogical with my commentary and respond to the panelists as opposed to going forth with my prepared remarks. So I want to open this, my remarks, with a quote from Michel Rouf-Trouillot, a dynamic anthropologist and a dynamic historian of Haitian descent. And he said that history is the fruit of power, and that power itself was never so transparent that its analysis has become superfluous. He says that the ultimate mark of power may be in its visibility, and that the ultimate challenge then for folks like you and I is the exposition of its roots. I really appreciated the opening question about drugs because it gets to a point that one of the participants in the chat, Victoria Lees, and I hope I'm getting her name correctly, said that this is deliberate. Diane also pointed out that this is intentional. I want to read John Ehrlichman's remarks, his famous and often cited quote that Diane mentioned. He said that you want to know what this was really about, speaking of the Nixon campaign in 1968. And he said that the Nixon White House, and this is the quote, after realizing that it had two enemies, essentially the hippies who were the anti-war left and the African Americans, or as he called them, the Blacks, who were tired of racialized oppression. And Nixon's administration had to figure out a strategy to both delegitimize and to criminalize both groups. And he says, hey man, look, we had to disrupt these communities. We couldn't arrest our way essentially out of this, but we had to find a way. And so we arrested their leaders, we raided their homes, we broke up their meetings, and we did it night after night after night, and it made the evening news. And I'm paraphrasing a bit. He said, did we know that we was lying about the association of Black and brown people, African Americans, hippies, poor whites with drugs? Sure, we knew that this was a lie, but it served their ends, both to push forth a white nationalist, a white supremacist agenda, and also to delegitimize those who were seeking legitimate redress. So I want to first say to you that this is deliberate, and any other synonym that we can come up with, whether it's intentionality, we need to be using and evoking those terms. So when it comes to thinking about unintended consequences, it gets difficult for me. It gets a little uncomfortable for me, because in many ways, public policy not only sort of conveys one's moral compass, but in fact, it conveys their agenda of nation building. And so in thinking about police powers, it's important that we historicize it, as Michel Rouf-Trouillot tells us to do. That Neill just told us that we have to look at the history of these social phenomena, the subject matter. And so what I want to do, in fact, is shape my comments around the courts, the police, and the legislature. Stated differently, I want to think about accountability, I want to think about transparency, and I want to think about responsibility. And so I want to start with accountability. One of the most dangerous policies that has affected law enforcement and Black and brown communities is qualified immunity. And qualified immunity is a thorn, is something that many folks who are in the throes of police reform have constantly asked redress, both from our state and our federal legislatures. And we've also asked the Supreme Court to revisit this. Because in fact, qualified immunity developed in 1967 was made out of whole cloth, right? They sort of made law out of nothing. But I want to go to the history of it. In 1871, or let's just back up a little bit. In 1865, we just ended the Civil War. Millions of people were killed in the battlefields. And we begin to embark on this road of what we call the Reconstruction moment, which only lasted for 12 years. And we had the 13th Amendment. And then we had the 14th Amendment, which was codified in the US Code 42, USC 1983, which basically said that people who are, and then I'm paraphrasing, that people who are wronged by members, official representatives of the government, to include the police, have a right to sue and seek redress in the court, civil suits. And that local government and police are liable. Now, why would this in fact be necessary? Well, in 1871, there was also a need to create what was known as the Ku Klux Klan Act, which was the Civil Rights Act of 1867, or 1868, I apologize if I'm getting the year incorrect, because African Americans were suffering brutal lynchings, brutal rapes. Our communities that we were building in earnest, our parallel economies, only because we were excluded from mainstream economies, were being destroyed by not just average white citizens, but it was being destroyed by the police. The police often led campaigns, lynching campaigns, expulsion campaigns of Black people out of cities. And of course, you know that the 4.5 million or so African Americans who were manumitted by way of the 13th Amendment, the Emancipation Proclamation, essentially, didn't have the resources to have the ability to move north. So they were stuck in the South. And they were stuck under both the threat of, and the actual violence of white citizens who were resistant to seeing them as full citizens, the 14th Amendment, and wanted to, in fact, re-enslave them through loopholes in the 13th Amendment. And so the government came in and said, as part of this Reconstruction Act, we need to protect the interests of Black folk, of African Americans. Now, in 1961, there was some Episcopalian priests, about 15 in total. 12 were white, all male, and 3 were African Americans. And they were challenging, in 1861, separate but equal. And I want to point out to you that Plessy v. Ferguson, which was a Supreme Court decision where the Chief Justice, Justice Taney, said that Black people have no rights that white people are bound to respect. Let me take it back a little bit further. In 1852, there was a Dred Scott decision, right? In fact, where they said Black folk have no rights that white folk are bound to respect. And Plessy versus Ferguson, to correct myself, enshrined and determined and made legitimate separate but equal. And so by 1961, we had already seen Brown versus Board and some subsequent Supreme Court decisions that said that separate but equal is unconstitutional. And so 14 Episcopalian priests went into the South as what we call Freedom Rise to attempt to overthrow this barbaric system. And they were arrested. And the short of the long story is that in fact they sued. And in the lower court, they were successful, not only getting the charges dropped against them, but also suing the police and denying the police the right to claim qualified immunity. Well, the Warren Court in 1967 determined that those police officers that arrested those 14 Episcopalian priests should have received qualified immunity. But even more so, what they realized, the Supreme Court, and I'll end with this and sort of carry this sort of thought process further in subsequent questions. What the Warren Court realized was that the police were the ringleaders, if in fact, of many of the violence that was perpetrated against Black people. If you actually look at some of the postcards of lynching victims, you will see that the lynching victims are handcuffed. You will see that there are sheriffs and sheriff deputies and other police force that are in the crowd smiling for the camera. But what the Warren Court realized in the 1960s is that if in fact Black folk begin to sue the police for civil damages, it would totally clog the court. It would bring justice, or what we might call injustice, to a halt. And so this decision then to sort of come up with qualified immunity with this particular test was to hamstring the civil rights movement. Now, what the Warren Court did in 1967 was sort of advanced in decisions made in 1982 and then 1989, which hopefully I'll get to talk about. But just to get to an example, qualified immunity is a public policy that maybe the Warren Court, it was an 8-1 decision. Of course, Thurgood Marshall went against the majority, but the majority won. It was a decision by quote unquote well-meaning people that we just don't want police officers to have to think twice about their split-second decisions. And surely no one wants to be in the place of a police officer who is in fact feels threatened by doing what's right on one hand, and then by doing what's right on the other hand. So they choose one side, and it happens to be that that side they choose is against the interests of African-American people. Keep this in mind that the Warren Court, just a few months later, would vote affirmatively that interracial marriages, Virginia v. Loving, in 1967, was unconstitutional and was an act of white supremacy. So I can't figure this out, where the Warren Court is, but I know that the history of the United States Supreme Court has been one that has affirmed not only white supremacy, but the oppression of Black people.
So I'm speechless, right? Because wow, that was incredible. Because when you and I talked, I knew you were going to say something that I was totally not expecting, and that was a wonderful rundown on history. I myself am mesmerized by two historical periods in for our country, and one of those is World War II, and the second one is Reconstruction. And that was amazing. Thank you. Because I was going to ask you, about things like pretextual stops and stop and frisk. And those seem so mundane in some ways if you're not thinking of the whole holistic history of how all of these laws and policies come about. So I appreciate that. So thank you everyone for your introductory statements. There's some follow-up questions that I wrote, but I think that I would like to go ahead and go to the chat because people put some really, really interesting questions in the chat as well. And I want to make sure that we get to them. Gus Griffin asked this question. As a follow-up to Eric's question, this may be to you, Neill, I'm not sure. At this point in history, after what is well documented in the books, The New Jim Crow and the Color of Law, why is it still believed that the current systems can be reformed? That, for me, that's a rhetorical question, but I'm going to let one of the panelists answer that, Neill, or anyone else who may want to jump in on that question.
Yeah, so, as far as, believing that the current systems can still be reformed, I do believe that number is shrinking, at least among my friends. We realize with many of these systems that we're dealing with, they just need to be done away with. And you see, when you use the term reform, you're talking about reshaping something. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a different outcome. or it's going to be better or improved or whatever, or solve some of the issues or problem. You're just reshaping it. Just like as we talk about police reform, and Kalfani, you talked a lot about history. God, there was some really good stuff. You know, when you look at the history of policing in this country, you can't reform it. You just can't. You have to scrap our whole public safety framework right now. As a matter of fact, you might want to scrap the whole justice system. But at least for policing and this whole reform effort, the policing was about, you know, rounding up runaway slaves. If you really look at the history of it and where police officers and the whole policing scheme came from, you know, protecting the property of the rich. And of course, back then, slaves were property of the rich. So, you know, rounding up escaped slaves and then coming forward, the role that the KKK and white supremacists have had and continue to have within policing, you know, the bottom line is you can't reform it. My opinion is you need to scrap it and you need to rebuild it. And I'll let others, you know, chime in, but I want to say something about the term unintended and intended. For this whole menthol thing that we're dealing with right now, you need to understand something. The initial group that I was referring to earlier is the African American Tobacco Council Leadership Control, African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council. Now, these are African Americans. And I truly believe that initially they didn't understand what these consequences, where they could go from a law enforcement justice perspective. But now that we have educated them over the past decade of the consequences, now I ask the question, so are they still unintended or are they intended? But for the most part, as we've heard throughout this conversation, these policies that we're talking about historically, and again, Khalfani, you talked about Richard Nixon and his time and Ehrlichman and that quote. And so when you even go back to early 1900s with people like Anslinger, you know, and who was the first drug czar, as I put it, in this country, and his racial and social agenda regarding Blacks and Mexicans in this country, Latinos in this country, and prohibiting, you know, what he did with cocaine and heroin and marijuana and prohibition effort and criminalizing it all. And a lot of people don't know that his number one target back then was Billie Holiday.
Yep.
That's right. That's right.
I'll pause there. I can go on and on.
So following up on what Neill was saying, and Kalfani, again, your remarks was, I can't wait to do the recording back so I can really go take notes on that. But we're talking about following up with what Neill is saying when he talked about menthol. It's the same thing with crack. Okay, crack was targeting the Black community. Menthol is targeting the Black community. And what we're going to see now is a substance that has been legal forever, whether I like it or not. And I don't like tobacco, I mean, just to say. But it is becoming the threat of becoming the new face of mass incarceration. We're talking about resulting in more felony convictions. We're talking about more mandatory minimum sentences, more revocations of probation and parole. We're talking about people more to be subject to the 3 strikes laws, more to be subject to fines and fees, as well as deportations. And also just the whole thing about the importance of connecting dots and really seeing the connections. Most folk, we all come out in mass in terms of these police killings and all like that. But most folk don't realize that not only Eric Garner, Lucy's, Sandra Bland, you know, she refused to put out her cigarette. Mike Brown, there's something dealing with tobacco over there. George Floyd, the same situation. I mean, it is very plain in our face. The handwriting is on the wall. And unless we forthrightly deal with it, and like you talked about the African American Tobacco Council, you know, or whatever it is, these dots have been connected. We need to deal with a harm reduction approach, a health approach, as opposed to a criminal punishment approach, because we've been there with where the criminal punishment approach leads us.
I would just add rather briefly, since we're talking about tobacco, that first of all, Alexandria through Georgetown, this Mid-Atlantic region was one of the hotbeds for enslavement of African people and the transport of enslaved people Midwest. But one of the major crops here wasn't cotton. Cotton wasn't king in the Mid-Atlantic. It was tobacco. And so, you know, if you look at the cigarettes of choice in our communities, Newport News, Virginia, a tobacco plantation. Winston-Salem's a private tobacco plantation. And you can actually take the packs of cigarettes and you can map it either to former plantations, or you can map it to regions of this sort of Mid-Atlantic area. Tobacco has never been a friend to us or the environment. Cultivating tobacco is rough on the soil, and it deplenishes the minerals and everything from the soil. It's a pretty tough crop to cultivate. But in terms of the question and sort of the draw on Ron and Sharon, who in the chat is evoking Brother Omawale, or better known Malcolm X. Malcolm X was very clear. He was not convinced, in fact, that policing could ever be reformed. And the evidence that's coming out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, is another moment, another sort of fact that we have a policing problem, and we have a problem with police officers, in fact, annihilating Black life, both male and female. What I would say, though, might be a little different here. Because my current research site is Baltimore. I'm looking at Greenmount Avenue and York Road, which is otherwise referred locally as the Green Mile. And I think, Neill, from Baltimore, you may be familiar with this area. You know, I don't want to pull out the police right now. And this runs counter to those who are abolitionists. I believe in much of everything that abolitionists say. I think that we need to do something about prison populations. We need to reform courts. And obviously, I think we need to reform police. But I'm concerned that there is a demographic within police, within the profession, that is being lost. There's people like Neill. There's people like myself, like Diane. There's people like Sonia. There's people like DeLacy Davis. There's other African Americans who have been trying to reform these institutions while we were there. And we are still trying to reform them, but we are Black officers. And so let me just say what that means. That means that we were too Black for the blue uniforms, and then, unfortunately, too blue for the Black community. Yeah. We sat in this interstitial space. And so we know, on the one hand, that there is real crime in our communities that we have to figure out a way of addressing. And those solutions have to be structural, not necessarily punitive, right? But until we develop the structural support to improve our communities, better schools, increased jobs, better recreation area, better infrastructure, et cetera, then we have to figure out, how do we safekeep and protect and serve, legitimately so, those who are striving for a better quality of life, right? On the other hand, in terms of reform, I'll be the first to tell you that it's not a question about bad apples. It's the system. The system has been compromised. This system in 1704 was instituted around policing women, policing poor white people, policing free Negro populations, but most importantly, policing enslaved Africans, right? And so the system was designed towards our oppression. I'm not shocked that Freddie Gray was chased down the block. He didn't suffer from drapetomania. He was chased down the block because he was Black, and this is about social control and order maintenance. I'm very clear. He didn't commit any crimes. He was socializing with a colleague on the corner, right? I'm very clear about that. So the system ultimately needs to be undone and redone in our interests.
So, boy, I'll tell you, I love listening to passion and policy wonkiness, because this is such a critically important conversation. The reason LEAP exists, the reason Shawn's organization exists and Sonia's organization exists is that we support exactly what you're saying, Kalfani, is that we have, and it's not us as citizens, it's our legislators have never fully invested in infrastructure at the front end of a criminal justice system that they siloed away from everything else that is much more efficacious in the intervention and the prevention of crime. And so my organization, you know, the big shoes that I'm following up in Neill exists to pull back the footprint of the criminal justice system and to advocate for solutions. One of the things we're working on is community responder models across the country right now that basically lessens a police intervention into minor offenses. You know, whether it's a traffic stop, like a real super low level traffic accident, or a barking dog call. You know, there's violence interrupters that can be used. There's mental health components, all sorts of different programs. So that's one of the, you know, you start looking at long-term solutions about transforming. I don't use the word reform anymore. I say we have to transform the whole entire system, and we have to stop siloing criminal justice and rename it completely. So in the last few years, Neill and I have talked about this extensively. I don't even refer to public safety as public safety because it's exclusive of the community. We really need to talk about public safety as community health and safety, design programs and intervention that supports community health, and ask the community to be an equal stakeholder in that process. But I also want to be super, super clear that law enforcement gets thrown every societal problem that we have never been capable of fixing. And we have to start holding legislators accountable. I spend a lot of time both at the state, local, and federal legislative process with staffers and legislators. And I think it's really important that we need to tell them, and they need to understand that a law, no matter how benign it may appear at its face, that you are granting law enforcement the authority to use force up to killing people for that law. And the reaction I get from legislators and their staffers who should know exactly that's it, this is how the law works, is they're stunned because no one has ever told them that. And so we as advocates, we as law enforcement professionals need to really do almost a better job in educating our constituents who need to go back to their legislators because that's who they need to hear from.
Diane, I really appreciate you giving us some suggestions on how to move forward. One of our questions later on, if we have time, because we have so many great questions in the Q&A, is going to be about our solutions. But let me get back to the Q&A. There were a couple of questions that I saw that I thought we should try and address while we're here. Brandon asked this question, and it stood out to me not only because Brandon is one of my friends here at the college, and he always has great questions, but because it's something that was near and dear to my heart. And he asks, in the context of what we're talking about, how do you all feel about school resource officers, which are SROs? And do you think they should be in public elementary, middle, and high schools? I'm going to take a swing at that, and anyone else on the panel, if you could jump in. I have, in my previous life as a police officer, I had the honor to actually supervise school resource officers on 3 different occasions, as a sergeant, as an administrative lieutenant, and then once again, when I became the director of community engagement. I believed in the program as we presented it. I thought that many of our school resource officers were outstanding because they understood the assignment. They understood that we are not going in here to police these young people. We are going in here to make a difference in their lives. We're going in here to be a community liaison between the school community and the police department. And this is not about arresting young people, and especially Black and brown children, and putting them in the school to prison pipeline. They understood the assignment, many of the school resource officers. I understand why the public takes issue with school resource officers, because not everyone gets the assignment, whether it's in Montgomery County or any other jurisdiction in the United States. So I think my answer to that question is, I think the public should decide what is in their best interest and what's in the best interest of their children. Diane, I see you shaking your head. You're going to.
Sonia, I started our school resource officer program at Redondo, and at Redondo Union High School, and ended up, going to the middle schools a bit, and tried not to ever go into the elementary schools unless it was like a child abuse type situation. And I'm really conflicted about this, and I agree with you completely. But I know exactly what kind of school resource officer I was, and I was part of that community. And I still have kids today that were my kids then, who find me on social media and let me know that if it wasn't for me, they wouldn't have had anyone in their life, and it helped them. And so it's about, how do we balance that, and how do we ensure that the system itself, because what I've seen in the last few years relative to school resource officer issues is that teachers in many ways are abdicating their responsibility to be good teachers and manage and class discipline. And I don't mean that in a negative or a positive. It's how do you deal with kids that are unruly? And so they're calling the cops to handle their job, and administrators are doing the same thing. So it goes back to, what do the parents want is the first place that we should be, but we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Otherwise, I saved kids' lives who were suicidal on my campus. I love these kids. It was the best experience. And how do we put the right police officers in that job? That's the other question.
Diane?
Well, let me just give perspective, if I may, as someone who doesn't come from a law enforcement background. I think it's already been said that the good folk and the bad folk, the good apples and the bad apples. I think one of the things is that when I talked about slippery slope, in some cases, it is another part of that slippery slope into the criminal punishment system at a very, very early age. Perhaps why is it that school resource officers have to come out of the police departments or out of law enforcement, just like the whole trend now in terms of taking mental health responses out of police department and putting it in the hands of responders who are trained in that. Maybe some other part of the social structure should deal with that as opposed to law enforcement. I don't know. It just gives a perception, particularly when SROs are primarily in Black communities or in the school districts. When my daughter went to school, there was no metal detectors, there were no SROs, and the like. But she was in a different community going to school. So I'm just putting that out there.
So I'm hearing some things that I agree with and disagree with. And when the community, however, decides that they want a uniformed person in the school, again, if you do that without, and Diane, I think you mentioned this, a really, really good selection process, right? And what tends to happen in a lot of these schools is that resource officer happens to be someone who's close to retirement. That resource officer happens to be someone who is being shunned by the law enforcement community. They're kind of like, okay, you don't want to go out here and lock people up because we have that little unspoken quota thing out there. All right, well, we'll put you in a school. All right, you can go babysit, right? And it's looked upon as something that that is bad. So if you don't have a really good selection process, if that's what the community wants, then you're going to fail those kids big time. Yeah, having a Diane there, having a Sonia there, having, you know, someone who, you know, who's going to look at these children from maybe a parental perspective first, right? And who knows how to solve certain issues, and who will require the administration to handle their business. Don't pull us into something that you should be solving and dealing with, is one thing. Now, Nkechi, this is what we're talking about as far as scrapping a system and building something new. Diane, you talked about it, getting the community as a real partner, right? No, you're not just called in to help us solve this. No, you're part of it. You're the main entity here in deciding what our public health and safety process is going to look like, right? So let's talk about our schools, right? What do we want to do for our schools? Elementary, middle, you know, high school. I never had it in elementary. I never had it in it was junior high back in my day, not middle school. But in senior high, we had one plainclothes resource officer, not wearing a uniform, Mr. Kelly, dynamite guy, wanted to be there and understood how to interact with kids. And I'll end here. When I was the head of training for the Baltimore Police Department, we had a high school that we were a part of. It was Walbrook High School in West Baltimore. And we had a uniform services, it was a uniform services academy. And the two officers that were assigned from the police department to that section in that school came from the academy. I mean, they came from under my command. And we had a serious, robust recruitment process with appropriate rewards for selecting the right people to put in there with those kids. And these were some dynamite men and women wearing the uniform. They wanted it that way in the community, so that's what we did. And it worked out just fine. But here's the other part. The principal of that school at that time, Mr. Andre Bunley, was unfreaking believable. Every kid in that school had his cell phone number. Fights, guns, all of this stuff was discovered well ahead of time because kids trusted Mr. Andre Bunley. And they called him and gave him information about what was about to go down, what was about to happen. And you know what? Very, very seldom did the police have to get involved in anything that could have risen to a criminal nature, because the administrator, along with his staff in that school, knew their responsibility and knew how to interact with those kids. So again, whether it's teachers, whether it's principals, whether it's resource officers, we don't do the very best in selecting the right people for those positions in these schools that we have. And, you know, I'm stating the problem, but hopefully somewhere out there, you know, there are some really good solutions for making this happen. Baltimore's education system and the school headquarters on North Avenue, which is, it's just a big hole for dumping money into, but that's another conversation.
You know what, Neill, I agree with you. It's a beautiful building on North Avenue, but you almost wonder what is his purpose, I mean, you know, there's so much to say about the school system. Just really quick, Nancy asked, were there studies about SROs, or were there studies about this punitive approach we taken to schools with regards to having armed guards there? And I would just point folk to my fellow ethnographist and brother and friend, Victor Rios. And Victor Rios is on the West Coast, but he writes about how these systems are more punitive and help to facilitate the prison to pipeline experience. I would simply say, thinking about Diane, you know, why can't we, you know, it's ironic, we're having this conversation about, you know, taking a public health approach to heroin addicts. And I'm just going to be candid, the elephant is in the room, but the heroin addicts by and large are white suburbans, right? Suburbanites. And so it's not a moral panic, but it's a moral crisis. It's a public health crisis. And I wish that was the same for crack cocaine, just to bring us back to where we begun. But if we're having this conversation about a public health model, but we're treating our children in school as if they're at risk. What if we took a different paradigm? What if we treated them as if they were at promise? And if they were at promise, if we had approached them in that way, we would simply understand that you can't learn and thrive in an unstable, insecure environment. When you see metal detectors, you're frisked and searched, and you have armed guards walking with AR-15 and other accoutrements from their 1033 program, it engenders a sense of insecurity. And you can't learn in that environment. Try learning on the battlefield. You can't do it. Yeah. And so I do think we need to pull SROs out of schools, or we need to find a way to reintroduce SROs who don't have to necessarily be young, but they got to be from the community. Mm-hmm. Like the rule is, there's a residential requirement. You can't just be an interloper who comes from the far suburbs. You live in the far ends of the county, and because you work for that police department, you're entitled to work in our school systems. And so, Neill, I agree with you. We need to determine who gets to work amongst our children.
Thank you. Go ahead, Nkechi.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, all these thoughts are just rolling through my mind. This is an excellent conversation. It just popped in my mind, just food for thought. You know, at the same time that we see this country moving away from the criminalization of cannabis, it's seeking to criminalize other things. And you have a situation in Ocean City where you have excessive use of force on Black youth for vaping. Yeah, that's on one hand. Yeah, on the other hand, there's this massive moves towards, rightfully so, okay, decriminalization and treating other things as health approaches. So it's just food for thought to me. What do we deal with these types of disparities, or this on one hand and this on the other hand? How can we just bring it all back to where it needs to be?
Nkechi, I'm going to save that question for the last thing that we talk about. What are the solutions? What is everyone's? Some of you have already given what you think solutions should be, but we'll give everyone a final opportunity to talk about solutions. I saw two more questions in the chat that I'm going to try and get to if we have time. This one really stood out to me, and I'm not surprised it was asked, but let me find it. Maybe I should put my glasses on so I can actually see the questions, right? Because when we have discussions like this and we have panelists such as these, people have questions about our personal experiences and what we have brought to the table. We have people like Diane who broke the glass ceiling in her police department, myself, those of us who are Black police officers, and now I can't find the question because I hope I didn't erase it. Here it is. This is a really great question, Nancy. And for some people, it would probably be a sensitive question, but the question is, with their long and varied careers in law enforcement, how did members of the panel who served as police officers deal with enforcing laws that were or are created to marginalize the Black and Brown communities? That is an outstanding question, because I'll start, if I may. As I've always said, if you are a woman, or if you are a Black or Latino, Asian officer, LGBTQ, you're going to have a moment in your career where you're going to question, number one, why you're there, and number two, do I stay? Because now I'm being asked, I'm being almost forced to make a decision between, for me, whether I'm a Black woman or whether I'm blue. And so then you have to sit with yourself and make a decision, because your livelihood may depend on it, your family may depend on it. As far as enforcing laws, I never saw, there's a thing called discretion that police officers have. And I was big into discretion. If there's another way to handle this particular situation, this is what I'm going to do. I was not arrest heavy. I made my share of arrests, but that wasn't my first go-to. And then thirdly, and so I can give other people a chance to respond, because I could talk about this for like another 2 hours. We are given we take an oath. We swear to do certain things, and that's to act ethically. We swear to abide by the Constitution, local laws, state laws. It wasn't difficult to make decisions that I thought were in the best interest of the people that I was serving. And in addition, I saw that the community were stakeholders. They weren't us and them as some, as we're taught. They were stakeholders, and they were my community as well. But I'm going to let other people jump in on this.
I just want to say basically everything that Sonia said is pretty accurate. In my career, I also had a brother who suffered from substance use disorder, bipolar, and had been criminalized at various portions of his life and died from a drug overdose, which is what brought me to this advocacy work, which I think is important. And when you talk about discretion and its importance, is there are people who understand how to wield discretion very well. And I think law enforcement does a very poor job of teaching officers how to use discretion, because the metrics of success in our communities is wrong. We judge law enforcement by the number of felony arrests, the number of tickets they write, the productivity that is meaningless, versus judging law enforcement for how they serve their constituents in their community, how their community views them, and the absence of crime. And so when we, again, linking it back to how do we transform the system, systemically, it also has to be transformed to develop different metrics of judging positive outcomes. And it can't be done just in a silo.
So just real quick, this can be a very delicate walk, because if you don't go far enough, change doesn't occur. And if you go too far, they fire you, or they put you someplace where you can't be effective anymore. One in particular with the state police, as the regional commander for the Bureau of Drug and Criminal Enforcement, I had a young trooper, black trooper, who just kept seeking an audience with me. And, in policing, you gotta go through the chain of command. You got to deal with your sergeant first, then your first sergeant, then your lieutenant, then your captain before you get to the major. But he was so persistent, I just said, okay, let's bypass all that. What's going on? He was complaining about his evaluation and how he was rated low in incentive. And I said, so you got to go out there and work undercover and make your cases and do whatever. He says, but Major, I can't do it. He says, because they're always loaning me out from one task force to the next. So I'm working everybody else's cases. I can't work my own. And I looked a little further into them. What was happening is they were taking this young black undercover agent and moving him to all the black communities throughout the state, one after another. And I was like, what's going on here? And it was clear what we were doing was targeting black communities, sending our black young men and women into these communities to arrest as many people as we can. And having the authority at that time to say, nope, no more, we're not going to be doing this anymore. This is how we're going to go about our cases. And I still wasn't at that place in education where I am now, but I was on my way. And so being able to change that was very effective for a while, because then I eventually retired and it's back to how things were before. And the second thing real quick is, and this is what happens when you do realize that something's askew and you bring attention to it and you try to do it the right way. When I was with Baltimore, I noticed that we were spending a lot of money that could have been spent somewhere else in the city. We were spending $230,000 a month on rental cars to go out and jump out on corners with drug cases. Just, again, a numbers game, $230,000 a month. And we were closing down rec centers at the same time, bringing that to the attention and saying that we didn't need to do this and we could get cars from, we could do something else, pissed off the commissioner. And he gave me an ultimatum. He said, you can do this, or you can resign, or you can do whatever. I said, no. I said, you'll have to fire me. And that was his option. And he fired me. But it gave me an opportunity in firing me. It raised enough stink that I could get that information out to the press. But then again, once you're gone, after a few weeks, a couple of months, it's back to the same old again. So it's a delicate walk, whatever the issue is that you're trying to make a change in.
Yeah, so Neill, I would say that we're not without loss. I think now is the time to be as vocal as possible, because you've seen the inside. You're not a fink, you're not a spy, you're not spying on the agency, but you are a professional member and you see the contradiction. And now it's the time, like Sonia, like myself, like many others, is to be vocal. Tell what we know, because we know something that the average Black citizen, white citizen, or Latino citizen, they don't. We're in both worlds, so to speak. I want to sort of give my solutions and try to do this in 1 minute. One, I wanted to talk to you all about police unions. When I was talking about, I mentioned my desire to talk about transparency. We won't have the opportunity for me to entertain that right now, but I would simply say a solution: police unions should no longer be allowed to sort of participate in the adjudication of infractions and punishment. They should only be involved in wages and hours. And I think that's a solution. The second thing is, I think that we need to teach police officers history. Assuming that we will never get police officers or abolish law enforcement, why is it that you're able to police my community and you don't know anything about me or the history of race in this society? Police officers were developed, as I said, to police women's sexuality and make sure they were chaste, to police queer sexuality, and to police Black bodies, whether free or enslaved. And I think it's important that we teach police officers the history of the uniform. Our uniform is drenched in both contradiction and blood of the oppressed. And you coming out of the academy, you should know that, right? Which I think would help with us achieving 21st century policing. And then thirdly, I think we need to do something about FTOs. There's a lot of areas that we can intervene in policing. I think that Officer Lucky, who was with Kim Potter on that sad day where Dante Wright lost his life, she didn't have to direct him to pull over that Black motorist. One of the things that we know in this society, that the organizing principle in America is race. And to be white in this society is to be scrupulous, to have a surplus of credibility, meaning that you have more authority. To be Black means to be that you're unscrupulous. You have a deficit of credibility and you lack more authority. You are simply someone, whether you're in the badge and uniform, you're probably presuming competent, or in the profession by affirmative action, or if you're outside the uniform, you are a criminal waiting to be discovered, or all the above. And so, I think looking at FTOs, that Officer Lucky understood something in the presence of his counterpart, this white female FTO, this training, that intersection was where we go find crimes. You pulled this young brother over for a hanging air freshener. Come on. So when Sonia, you say, what about these laws? Man, I've done, Terry stops, whether they've been pedestrian or actual traffic stops. And I've stopped people from some of the most humbug reasons. These are investigatory stops. We're looking for something. As we say in law enforcement, we are fishing, right? But why do we always think that the pond to fish in is in the Black community? Matter of fact, why do we think Black people are the ones who, are the big fish to catch? It's because we have this idea that we know a priori about race and who is the perpetual criminal. And so if another place that we can intervene in is FTO programs. I think these are some of the worst programs because they help to reinforce the racial prejudices and the sexisms and patriarchy, misogyny, and homophobia that we're trying to deal with and rid out of society.
Thank you.
that one
So
little
we are about
solution?
to wrap up. So Nkechi, Neill, Diane, if you want to throw out a couple of solutions for our audience that's still here, so we can wrap up the conversation, I'd appreciate
Just one quick
it.
one.
Okay.
Just one quick one, that we really need to move from a criminal punishment approach to a health-centered approach. And where there are issues, we need to seriously look at ways to reduce the harm that does not involve criminalization.
I'm going to go with Dr. Ture relative to the issue of FTOs and education. There is a distinctive lack of historical education on policing, and it needs to be implemented across the nation. But I'd also say the emphasis is not just on FTOs, but on first line supervisors as well, is because those are the two rocks to your operational organizations. And if you don't have good FTOs or frontline supervisors, you get exactly what we get sometimes. So thank you very much. It was an amazing panel.
Neill?
This has been great, thanks. Somewhere, and this is where I get conflicted sometimes, but somewhere, I mean, the answer really is with our elected officials, because they really do hold so many of the strings and everything that we're talking about here. So again, I just got a question: how can we do a better job of applying more pressure on our elected officials, and beginning at a local level, because that's where it's obviously easiest. And I think our individual members here, the audience members, can be most effective in their towns and counties in taking an active role in holding their elected officials accountable. Kalfani, as you said, being very vocal, finding a way, using social media, doing whatever you can to get it out, and to be bold in calling out these elected officials who aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, whether it's a budget, whether it's our educational system, whatever it may be, and just figure out where you can be most impactful in making that happen. And don't think too broadly, just find a very narrow path that you can hone in on and just beat the crap out of it. And others will do their part, and hopefully it all comes together. Thanks.
And so I will say, there's a mandate to the community that we have to be vigilant. Neill, I'm following up your comments. And, someone put in the chat, I think, Ron Hampton, about, these are things that we've been talking about for decades now. We can't stop the work, though. We have to keep trying to move the needle, however incremental that is. And that means that the community needs to be engaged, and because we are stakeholders, and we do. I'm a community member too, and I need to be involved in elections, and who's doing what in my community, who has the power to make change in legislature and all of that. So please stay engaged, continue to be educated, come to events like this that we put on here at Montgomery College. So thank you to the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminal Justice, and the Office of Equity and Inclusion for this first in our lunchtime series. We'll have more coming. We will let you know. You'll hear about it. We want you to come back and bring your lunch and something to drink. So thank you for coming. If I didn't get to your question in the chat, we will answer your questions offline, as long as we have your email address. We'll make sure that the recording is available to everyone, as well as the bios of all of the panelists. So thank you for coming. If the panelists could just stay behind for a couple of minutes, I would appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you.